Welcome back. Our next afternoon session tackles the theme Privatization as a Reform for Prosperity. This panel will examine the role of privatization in economic reform and its potential to foster greater prosperity. Our first speaker is Nataliya Melnyk, the Executive Director of the Bendukidze Bendukidze Free Market Center, a prominent independent think tank based in Kyiv, Ukraine. Nataliya is recognized as a Ukrainian expert on economic education and frequently contributes to international discussions on the war in Ukraine and the nation's economic and political development. We are honored to welcome back Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. Professor Balcerowicz is a highly respected Polish economist and statesman, best known as the architect of Poland's groundbreaking post-communist economic reforms, often referred to as the Balcerowicz Plan, serving as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in Poland's first non-communist government from 1989 to 1991, and again later, 1997 to 2000. He implemented rapid stabilization, liberalization, and institutional changes, including large-scale privatization, which are credited with transforming Poland into one of Europe's fastest-growing economies. And completing our panel is Lord Syed Kamall. One applause for Syed Kamall. Lord Kamall is a distinguished figure in UK politics and academia, currently serving as a member of the House of Lords. He holds the position of a professor of politics and international relations at St. Mary's University, Twickenham, and serves as the academic and research director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a leading classical liberal think tank in London. And finally, moderating this panel, our volunteer from SFL, Filip Blaha. One applause for him. Filip previously led the Czech team as it became our global group of the year and currently works as an economic analyst on a project for the World Bank. Please welcome our panel for Privatization as a Reform for Prosperity.
I hope you are enjoying the conference same as we do, and I can promise you that rather than the previous panel, this won't be the discussion about regulation, but rather liberation and privatization, and which I don't think we have any better candidate to start this panel with one of the most distinguished and educated people in privatization, Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. So my question to you is, as you were the father of the privatization reforms in Poland, and you came up with the famous Balcerowicz plans. How do you look from today's perspective on the reforms in Poland? And would you maybe be more radical in some steps, or would you change anything? Or what would be the recommendation based on your experience for the aspiring young and politicians who want to also transform their countries?
Well, I will try to do more privatization than I managed to do, even though we are the pioneer of radical market-oriented reforms. Just to remind you, we inherited a catastrophic economic situation. Inflation was 50% a month. In the last month of '89, we are a bankrupt country vis-à-vis the foreign creditors, and we have inherited a deep recession. So this called for radical transformation and stabilization, which we started in 89, 91, and then tried to complete later on. Now, so my short answer is direction. First, you have to establish the direction, and away from socialist towards private ownership, economic freedom, and then the speed. And usually, the faster, the better, if you move in the right direction. But there are differences in maximum possible speed, and for example, you can liberalize the economy faster than privatize it. So there's a transitional period where you abandon socialism but not yet reach market competitive private ownership economy, and this is a very challenging period, but somehow we managed, even though we still have to finish privatization in Poland.
Now, switching to completely another case, Nataliya, as I also heard on multiple occasions in the SFL conference in Ukraine, you mentioned and describing how Ukraine has one of the most state-owned businesses and enterprises still. So, switching from Poland, who went through the economic transformation, now speaking of Ukraine, do you think, or how would you manage to do or design such a large reform in Ukraine given today's perspective and our liberal thinking? And what issues do you think that privatization in Ukraine could fix, like state corruption, the poverty, and other issues?
First of all, I want to establish the baseline. So privatization would not be something new for Ukraine, right? It's not a new reform. Our privatization law has been in place since 1992. So technically, we've been privatizing since 1992, just in waves. So we've been privatizing, nationalizing, reprivatizing, and so on and so forth. We're staying busy. But even if we're keeping in mind that 1992 as the launch of privatization, back in 2010, we still had over 3,000 state-owned enterprises, out of which about 20% were semi-profitable, right? So basically it shows that we have a lot of privatization left to do. We've been doing it slowly. We've been doing it over time, but privatization can be done in different ways, right? So our first try at privatization in the 90s gave birth to oligarchs. So it was all about privatization vouchers, meaning every single Ukrainian got a privatization voucher, which, if claimed, gave them shares of state-owned companies. 50 million vouchers were issued. Of course, people didn't really understand what they meant, so they hurried to exchange them for cash, for very cheap, and that's how oligarchs started building their assets. So back then we did it fast, but we did it in a wrong way. Then fast forward to late 90s, the situation, the type of privatization changed, and we did it differently. We did it through selling or attempting to sell the biggest companies in to bidders, right? But it was rigged auctions, it was insider trading, and that's how oligarchs who built up their wealth during the early 90s were able to get control over the biggest, most profitable enterprises in metallurgy, in energy, and so on and so forth. So of course, corruption can very easily go hand in hand with privatization. So basically, we were a textbook example of how not to do privatization. And then we went into the stage of digital, right, privatization, meaning open bidding. And I think it became one of our pastimes, actually. It's so exciting, almost as exciting as watching your national team play football. When you can easily follow online auctions and then see the increase in prices, right? When you start off with something very cheap and it's getting sold basically at the market value, and it shows people that it's transparent. They understand how it's happening. They can even themselves bid. We recently had a bid for a building of 1 hryvnia, right? So it usually starts very low. Of course, it didn't sell because they decided to reissue the auction. So with privatization, you need to be careful because corruption can intervene, and you need to have respect for property rights. Because if you privatize, then nationalize and re-privatize, it's giving the wrong signals to investors. And investors are the ones you want to come into the country. They would be the first adopters, let's say, of privatization. And we do have a positive example of re-privatization, actually. It was part of the fight with corruption in 2004. Krivorizhstal, which is a great, huge steel plant, was sold for $800 million. After the revolution, the Orange Revolution, it was so nationalized and re-privatized because it was undervalued. So from $800 million, it went to $4.8 billion, which reflected, more or less its market value. So, we are a cautionary tale. Don't do what we did, and make sure you have safeguards in place when you are carrying out privatization.
And finally, to go through our round, let's have some perspective on Britain, more specifically the Thatcher's reform. I think anybody in this room is well acquainted with the reforms, and I would be even bold to say that most people love it and would like to also have their reforms in their country. But my question is, Syed, given today's state of the Great Britain, when you left the European Union and you kind of are the masters of your own fate in those economical affairs, don't you think, or wouldn't you expect another stage of the privatization and liberal economic reforms in Great Britain in the same spirit?
I would hope so as a liberal, but I think we have to be honest. What happened in British politics, we had a conservative government trying to run socialism better than the socialists. So we try to introduce what I would call, and I'm a conservative politician, but I'm a classical liberal. You have to find a home in a political party somewhere, and you often choose the party you agree with most or the one you disagree with least in politics. I think the lessons from privatization generally is you should not look at privatization on its own. As the previous speakers have said, you should look at deregulation and liberalization. Because what you want to do as much as possible is just turn a state monopoly into a private monopoly, and then you've got crony capitalism. And you have to be very careful about crony capitalism. The second question is, why do you privatize? And there are different reasons. It could be because it's a drain on the government, on the exchequer. It could be because if you leave it in the state sector, it will be competing with all the other priorities that the government wants to spend taxpayers' money on, education, health, etc., so it gets underinvested. It could be actually that if it has the private sector disciplines, it will become profitable and then end up paying some taxes and raise revenue for the government rather than being a loss to the government. It might be actually because you want something that it doesn't have. And my PhD, I looked at the transition in Hungary of the Hungarian telecom sector, and I was trying to compare it with previous privatizations. First of all, you had the Post Telegraph and Telecoms, the PTT. Then you split the Post and the telecoms. Then you split regulation and operations. Then the operations of telecoms became a 100% joint stock company owned by the government. And then you sell stakes in it. That was one model. But when they sold stakes to outside investors, why do you want foreign investment? It's not just money. Sometimes it's materials, and sometimes it's knowledge transfer. So, for example, in Hungary, there was an American telecoms company and a German and a Deutsche Telekom who came in with a joint venture because Deutsche Telekom could bring technical knowledge and documentation, whereas the Americans could bring marketing and accounting. And you have to remember, in many of these telecoms organizations, when they were part of the state, there was no marketing, there was no accounts, there was no accountability. You waited ages to get a telephone line, and if you said something against the regime, you waited another 10 years or 15 years. So I think you have to look at why you privatized. Then the problem is, after you privatize, how do you make sure you have a competitive market? And one of the problems with some of our privatizations now is that we artificially created markets. So when we did railways, for example, we separated track from trains. Then we created over 20 train operating companies. We created train leasing companies. And we created a railway property company. And what happens after a while is that these companies buy each other up, and vertically integrate unless you stop it, and then you go back and get oligopolies and unaccountability again. And this is why railway privatisation, for example, in the UK is unpopular. The other thing we have to watch is who buys the shares. So when we privatised water, most of the money raised was able to be used to invest back in the water sector and to improve our water. But what happened is foreign pension funds bought shares for, good for their investment, but they leveraged the company, highly leveraged it with debt. And therefore now, one of the private water companies in London, Thames Water, and because it's in London, that's where the politicians are, where the journalists are, it's making privatisation very unpopular. So we always have to make sure, how do we not only privatise, but how do we liberalise and deregulate, and how do we make sure there's a competitive market, so when you tell the story of privatisation, it's a positive one.
Steve?
You want to react?
Well, perhaps a few remarks. First, diagnosis. State-owned enterprises are always bad because they are subject to political power, and politicians should not have economic power. The first. This is why privatization is substantial and very important, and importance varies depending on the share of state-owned enterprises. In the West, in France, in Britain under Mrs. Thatcher, there was a substantial state sector. This is why privatization, but nothing compared to what existed under in the socialist countries. So privatization in these cases are absolutely necessary, both for the economy and for politics. For politics in Central and Eastern Europe, fortunately, privatization was accompanied or even preceded by the introduction of democracy. So in Poland, Czech Republic, etc. In China, China would not have developed so fast without privatization, but in China, we don't have democracy. So different cases. Sorry.
So I think all of us in this room can agree, or at least I hope so, that privatization is the healthy process for economy, and it brings the certain benefits. However, we also may agree that we are here in a very strong social bubble, and given the voters' results and elections, I think we could name only a few examples where actually society or voters have a very high regard of privatization. What do you think there are the reasons? Is it because the privatization was done in a lot of countries badly and it turned into the oligarchic or more crony markets, or is it in just a general psychological view of voters that they are more lean to the leftist policies, and how possibly could the politicians or we as a liberals fight against it?
Okay.
So in our case, this public weariness of privatization was very justified for the reasons I explained, right? And if the public is against something, it's very easy to blow that out of proportions and manipulate it further on. You know, as soon as you hear the word privatization, it's like a trigger word because everyone is thinking about the 90s. And it becomes problematic because politicians tend to abuse that, right? And once again, if you restart talking about privatization, you can always use this fear and saying, oh, you will have Chinese come into Ukraine and buy everything. We had this situation with the land moratorium, right? So you couldn't sell agricultural land because it was property of the people, right? So it would rather stay empty and no one would take care of it, but you cannot sell it. That has changed, but the same with privatization. And it's very easy also, especially in Ukraine, to play around with a so-called strategic importance of certain state-owned companies, right? And it's very difficult to argue with that. Railways would be one of the biggest examples. Ukrainian railways have been instrumental to saving a lot of people after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, because that's how refugees got out, right? This is how we were able to travel with no airplane access, and so on. And this is used as a label to protect certain enterprises from even being considered up for privatization. And it's a problem because very few big companies are not considered to be of strategic importance. And at the same time, you can have ridiculous examples of state-owned enterprises that are considered super important and cannot be privatized, like the National Circus of Ukraine. It's cultural heritage. So, and it's just one example of a circus. We have a number of circuses that are SOEs. So when you look behind this label of cultural heritage or strategic importance, you will have quite a few of surprises there. The problem is not very many people look into it, right? They don't try to find the real information. And that's where I think the transparency of the procedure helps a lot, and the open bidding of it. So online auctions are something that have been very helpful. Unfortunately, right now, so-called big privatization is on pause because of the war, but small privatization is still happening. And we are slowly but surely getting ready of a lot of these things. And I think that it's all about informing the public what we're doing, why we're doing. And I mean, getting rid of inactive SOEs should not even be an issue, right? If something is not working, it's not operational, it cannot be of a strategic importance, right? Because we've lived without it so far, so it shouldn't be a problem. But I think a lot of it is, of course, on politicians who understand the right trajectory, but also on the social society, on the civil sector, right? On our NGOs and so on, because we need to protect the right kind of privatization.
I agree with what was said, that language matters, and one should avoid words which refer to something positive but have bad emotions, like privatization. People don't like the word privatization, even they like the effects of privatization. So in persuasion, in communication, in Poland, I never used the word of privatization, even though I was pushing for privatization. Instead, I was speaking about ownership changes, which is neutral. First. Second, it's very important to compare what was before privatization and what is the experience of other countries, so that people can form an objective, non-emotional judgment about. And third, even though, because to some extent of these emotional undertones, you can't expect widespread enthusiasm for privatization, you should do it. And in the Polish practice, there was never massive protest against privatization. So people may dislike the word, but accept the results, at least Polish experience.
So I would say, I mean, why do we believe in liberalisation? Why do we believe in competition? Why do we believe in deregulation? Because we believe in free societies, but we also believe it's better for the consumer. And consumer is king quite often in these things. And what happens when the consumer's experience changes? So, for example, when we privatised railways, we have to remember the 1970s and 80s, we had a state monopoly, British Railways, but that came into being after World War II, when the 4 private companies had been exhausted. There was no investment during the World War. Clearly, they had to have long trains, think about a war economy, and they basically ran, they basically utilised the tracks with no reinvestment, etc., and they had no money after the war. So the state nationalised it and created British Rail. Now, you and I know what happens when you nationalise. What happens, the consumer is no longer the king. And so therefore, the early days of privatisation, when people saw new trains, or saw different trains and new services and all the innovation that comes with competition and privatisation, they were in favour of railway privatisation. But over time, as you saw the rules changed. So one of the weird things we did in Britain is that the way we nationalised it and we created all these artificial organisations was that we, if you bought a franchise for, say, the West Coast, not only was it wasn't just good enough for the government that you saved money and maybe you made profit, and then when you make profit you pay some taxes and that's good for the economy, you actually had to pay a determined return to the Treasury. So part of your bid was how much money you were going to give to the Treasury. And what happened, a lot of companies who bid made unrealistic bids, and therefore it was uneconomic for them to run it on that basis, and they gave it back. The other thing that happened is when you've got so many different companies, some don't have monopolies on their own routes, you have lots of choice about how you get from A to B. And it became incredibly complicated to find the cheapest ticket. You know, there were some entrepreneurs who've now come up with ways, and they've got an app or whatever, and consumers didn't want that. They said, why am I paying this much when someone else can pay that much and for the same route or the same time? And it became incredibly complicated. And that's why privatisation of railways became unpopular. And people are now talking about 1970s and British Rail in a positive way, because that whole generation who've grown up have forgotten about how bad it was. Similarly with water. Water was great because there was investment when they first privatised. What happened over time was that as they got token, and also don't forget, people were issued with shares or could buy shares cheaply. So it's become people privatisation. But just like the vouchers in Ukraine and other countries, people sold their shares on day one or very early because they made profits. And then what happened, it got taken over by pension funds and others who, for their pension funds or for their funds, they leveraged highly so they could keep paying dividends. And therefore, there was a lack of investment in the water infrastructure. They were more interested in finances than actually running the company as a water company. So over time, we have to always bear in mind, when we privatise it, you've got to make sure there's a competitive market and an accountable market. Otherwise, people will long for a past that wasn't really there.
Thank you. So, Natalia, you mentioned that in Ukraine there is a state-owned circus. I can also, just for the fun, mention that nearby Slovakia has their own state-owned gambling company, and Czech Republic, because we are beer lovers, we're having our own national-owned beer production company. It's not one of the best beers, but
Really?
But
shocker.
yeah, it tends to be profitable, and I can also imagine that the gambling company would be profitable in Slovakia. So we all agree, or even most people agree, that the unprofitable state businesses needs to go away. But how to make a clear argument and proposition for those businesses which are profitable and generating income for the state? Because first and first, the voters won't think at the first sight it's a logical move, and also the state don't want to get rid of their source of income, because the states love to money and spending the others' money. So how to make a good argument or good reforms to get rid of these companies?
Well, fortunately for us, there are very few profitable state-owned enterprises, so it's a bit easier. I think that obviously appealing to consumers, explaining consumer choice, quality, innovation, because a very important part of, or side effect, right, of privatization would be innovation. And just the fact that they would be able to get better service, like in the case of the UK, is important. But also an additional advantage that came out of a very bad situation. In Ukraine right now, we have very limited amount of spare resources right now, right? So our budget deficit is growing. We are living on borrowed funds, essentially. The amount that we collect through taxes is only enough for supporting the existence of the armed forces and paying retired people and some salaries. Some, not even all. We can't cover doctors' salaries from our own resources. So then if you come out with a list of things that you would like to get rid of, people won't care too much, unless, like I said, we would go after Ukrainian railways. I mean, I think that's a battle that we will lose, the battle for privatization with that one, because it has established itself as a strategic company. And we know that our security situation will not change anytime soon. So security concerns will be a very strong excuse. But at the same time, we have a Ukrainian post service that is creating its own bank. Like, why? Like, for no reason, just because they can, right? And I'm sure it's the same in your countries. Post offices have prime real estate, right? If you look at the location of the main post offices, that's something that would, if sold, just that property, just moving them out of those locations would bring a lot of money. So we need to pick and choose our battles. But like, if you look at the most ridiculous examples of state-owned enterprises, it's not even the circus. We had a whale breeding enterprise in Ukraine, located in Vinnytsia, not even close to the sea. So we have a whale breeding enterprise and dog breeding enterprise. Well, dog breeding had an official excuse because they would breed service dogs that would go on to serve in the military, police force. It doesn't have to be a state-owned enterprise. But with whales, I'm not so sure. I have to look into it deeper. Maybe they would be like military whales swimming in the Black Sea or something. But like some of these ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous things that should not be state-owned, I'm not even saying they should be state-run, because we know that the government is a shitty manager. So state-run, it's just an oxymoron in my opinion. But we need to understand why it's state-owned, right? And if it's state-owned, we need to explain that it should not be. And again, who we are explaining to the consumers, because then the consumers can vote, you know, and bring in certain politicians into power that would make decisions like, you know, abandoning the land moratorium or maybe speeding up, right? Because we're not talking about the privatization reform, because like I said, it's happening. But speeding it up would be extremely helpful. And I'm hoping that as soon as the war is over, we will restart the big privatization. Because selling during the war is, as you can imagine, very problematic, especially due to the fact that even, there are interested investors for sure, but even if they come into Ukraine, sell something, the very next day it can be destroyed by a missile. So, you know, the risks are way too high right now. But I think our job is making sure that, you know, it's continuing after that, and for what reasons. And we have something to play around with. You know, if we bring in more money to the budget, we will be able to support the armed forces. You know, we will be able to have our own resources to buy the ammo, to buy the whatever we need to protect ourselves. So we also have this ammunition to use for the sake of privatization or faster privatization.
Well, this was about explanation. I mentioned two shortcuts I've been using in trying to undermine this anti-privatization propaganda. First, pointing out to Belarusia, where there's a lot of state ownership, and asking, do you like us to be like Belarusia with restoring the state ownership? And second, people usually do not like very much the politicians. So I'm pointing out, do you want to reduce the power of politicians, take away from them the power over enterprises? And it seems to me it's pretty effective. So two devices.
I think you hit an important point, is when the state organization is running a profit or a surplus, as they say. They don't like to say profit, they say surplus, don't they? Which they can then reinvest. One of the issues, though, is whether they reinvest that profit back in their services, or it just goes into the general pot to be spent on something else. The other thing I would say is, you know, pick your battles. You know, in politics, anyone who's read public choice theory, you know, you've got to be very careful about which battles you fight. So today in Britain, for example, I would say, you know, if there's lots of loss-making companies and they're terrible, or they've got a terrible reputation, it's state-run, then it's probably relatively easier to sell them off, especially if you do a public share and let members of the public buy them. And that's what made privatisation very popular in the early days. Anyone could buy shares, but of course what happened is that they sold those shares very quickly. But what I would also say, though, is think about whether you actually have to privatise that state. I mean, of course, you and I would prefer it was private and it was a competitive market, but there are probably so many things that you can privatise that, you know, leave the ones that have got a surplus for now. But also, at some stage, they may well be still have old infrastructure or old, you know, equipment or old procedures, and they can't modernise even though they are making a surplus. That's when you can then privatise, because the case for privatisation is, you know, they need an injection of cash and expertise. The government doesn't have that money. It will cost taxpayers 5% more on their tax bill. Therefore, let's privatise now. But I would not necessarily start with the ones that are making surpluses.
Can I add just a short remark? So, by being the person who runs Bendukidze Free Market Center, I have to go back to Kache Bendukidze, and he was radical supporter of privatization, and he said that we should sell everything except our conscience. But remembering that, there is one thing that we need to be aware of. Because of the number of state-owned enterprises in Ukraine, at some point, about every third Ukrainian worked for the state. So they were employed by state-owned enterprises. And that's a big concern, and that's a big power to politicians to talk against privatization, because they can say, you're going to lose your jobs. You're not going to be able to find a job. And this is something that you need to have counter-arguments to.
I think that speaks to a wider debate that we all have. When we are advocating for change, there are winners and losers. And as we know, international trade or privatization, liberalization, in that case, there are winners and losers. And quite often, the losers are concentrated, so they can organize and campaign. But the winners, they don't organize. They don't say, great, I've got cheaper prices and more competition. They don't all get together. So, in fact, quite often our consumer organisations are run by communists or people who, you know, or people who are very left-wing, who think the state should be doing stuff. So, therefore, it's a challenge that we face on many things, winners and losers. And how do we make sure that, you know, we address that issue?
We have a couple of last minutes, but we have time for some questions. And I see the advisor to the government member of the National Economic Advisors to the government has raised his hand, so give it to Moimir, please.
Thank you very much, and I've got a question for all of you. What would you privatize immediately now in your respective countries if you had the power to do that? Like with the stroke of a pen, be it in the UK, be it in Poland. Nataliya has mentioned a couple of examples in Ukraine, but I assume that you have got a longer list than what you have mentioned. So if you had the power, what would you do now, 2025, in year 2025?
Sorry? There should be a long list, and I don't have time to name the items on the list. I would privatize everything which is still state-owned. And the burden of the...
I would start with the low-hanging fruit as a case for success, all inactive companies. Just get rid of them, and then keep cutting after that.
I think it's more complicated in the UK because some of our privatisations are now unpopular, and it's a real challenge. But actually, at some stage, I think two things might come up. If we have a Labour government that builds lots of state housing, a future Conservative government can sell them to their owners. Or their owners. The other thing is, once the nationalisation of railways becomes an issue and people are getting bad service, we could re-privatise it, but in a different way. I would follow the Japanese model, because that way the companies, they own their property, their railways and their infrastructure, if that's possible in Britain, and they actually make money on property development to pay for the railways. But I think it's more difficult in the UK because some of our privatisations have become unpopular. Actually, I'm a shadow health minister. I've been a health minister. I would not privatize the NHS. What I want to do is I want to grow non-state. And the same thing when it comes to, my wider thing is, if you are a classical liberal and you want a smaller state, the first accusation against you is you don't care about the poor or the needy. And I think what we need to do as classical liberals is not just talk about a smaller state, but actually grow civil society. Go and grow organizations that are not necessarily private for profit, but non-state, that can tackle poverty and some of the real problems we see often much better than the state. And that way, we can show conservatives who think they can run socialism better than the socialists, and the people on the left, that there is an alternative to the state when we want a smaller state.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Here. Yeah. And please be quick.
It's not a question, it's rather a comment on what Nataliya said about voucher privatization and the rise of oligarchy in Ukraine. I think that the voucher privatization is not the thing to be blamed for the rise of oligarchy. In fact, Ukraine is a very instructive example of why privatization has to be complemented with liberalization. You had very rapid privatization, but very partial liberalization, which gave rise to arbitrage, the so-called arbitrage between, for example, very low prices controlled by government and high market prices. It was, in fact, the partial liberalization gave rise to very extensive rent-seeking behavior that enriched the wannabe oligarchs. Thank you.
It's not responsible, it's what contributed. The problem was not in the voucher system itself, it was in the fact that these 50 million people did not see the value in that piece of paper, but they saw the value in cash. And if you have a situation like that, then it's no wonder that the small percentage that understand the value of shares, right, compared to cash, they were able to capitalize on it.
Yes, but then, like, of course, they got some assets, but also then they could earn a lot of money on, for example, energy arbitrage, and which was not connected with voucher privatization at all, but it was connected with very partial liberalization, which enabled such rent-seeking behavior.
We just did it wrong for many reasons, and informing the public was a big part of it all. Because my parents can't even remember having those vouchers, right? So for them it was so meaningless that they even forgot what they got for it. But they had it for sure.
And I'm afraid that will be end of our panel discussion. Thank you again very much, Professor Balcerowicz. Nataliya Melnyk and Syed Kamall.